Good evening, everyone. Thanks for your patience. My name is Dina Okamoto, and I'm the director of the Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity in Society here at Indiana University. I'm also a professor in the Sociology department. I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight for the Confronting Racism series. We're in week 2 of the 7-week program, which is streaming live on Tuesdays at 8 p.m. on Facebook. Tonight, we'll be talking about policing, which is a very timely topic here in Bloomington and across the nation. We're also really excited to hear from our panelists tonight, given the racial profiling, also the case of hate crime in Bloomington. A number of things have gone on this week, and we're really excited to hear from our panelists to process these issues. So this series is a collaborative effort between Indiana University's Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity in Society, also the Arts and Humanities Council, and the College Arts and Humanities Institute. And it's generously supported by the Office for the Vice Provost for Research and the Public Humanities Project. I also especially want to thank and recognize Ed Commentale, Joe Hyland, Michelle Moyd, Deb Cohen, as well as the A&H and the CREST staff for all helping to put this program together. It really wouldn't be possible without all of these folks. So just briefly, this series was inspired by nationwide protests against police violence and systemic racism and in support of Black lives. And we really wanted to foster conversations to try to help unpack the histories and the social realities of race, racism, and anti-Blackness in the United States. We also wanted to try to explore modes of protest, resistance, and rebellion that are used to confront these thorny issues. And we know that racism is entrenched in our histories, also our institutions, policies, and practices, and that it remains pervasive today. And so we hope that this series can shed some light on what we think is one of the most urgent and important issues of our time. We also hope that this series will open up renewed possibilities for social change. And so that over the next few weeks, we'll be bringing together experts in the arts, humanities, and social sciences to discuss issues, again, related to race and protest. Tonight, we'll be talking about policing. Next week, we'll talk about protest and social change. In the following weeks, we'll talk about media and technology, Indigenous perspectives, and also global systems. So before I introduce tonight's program, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge and honor the Indigenous communities native to this region and recognize that Indiana University is built on Indigenous homelands. We also recognize the Miami, the Delaware, the Potawatomi, and the Shawnee people as past, present, and future caretakers, of this land. So tonight's program is about policing, as I mentioned, and I'd like to introduce our moderator for tonight. And it's Michelle Moyd. She's the Ruth N. Knowles Associate Professor in the Department of History and the Associate Director of the Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity in Society here at Indiana University. She's the Associate Editor of American Historical Review. She's also a very accomplished scholar. She's an expert in African and US histories, and she studies empire, militarization, and the colonial state. So again, thank you for joining us tonight. We're really excited about the panel of experts that we have that are going to talk with us tonight. They have wonderful ideas. They're very accomplished in their own rights as well. So right now I'd like to turn things over to Michelle, who will introduce our panelists.
Okay, thank you, Dina, and I would like to echo her thanks to Ed Commentale and his team, as well as to Deb Cohen. And thank you to you all for tuning in and for bearing with us as we handled these the tech glitches. I thought that tonight I would spend a little bit of time just talking about one of the key, the key concept in the title of this series, which is confronting race. And I wanted to just spend a couple minutes explaining what we mean when we talk about race. I'm very grateful to Dina and to Terry Francis for giving me some talking points to help me break down what is a very vast and complex scholarly literature on the topic, but to hopefully give you some ways into thinking with us over this series. So race has been one of the most powerful and persistent group boundaries in American history, distinguishing between the experiences of those classified as non-white from those classified as white, with often significant consequences, devastating for some, uplifting for others. Race is not biological. There is no biological basis for the conception of distinct races. Race is socially constructed. It is a concept, an ideology developed during the late 17th century, alongside the establishment of African slavery as the dominant unfree labor regime in the Americas. In an era when the dominant political philosophy was equality, democracy, and freedom, the only way that slavery could be justified was to demote Africans to non-human status. Creating the idea of race was an effective way to do so. As the idea of race evolved, white superiority took on the trappings of something like common sense, in which it became widely accepted as a social ordering principle, even as it also became increasingly invisible as an economic and political ordering principle. Not only did it serve as a justification for slavery, but also for the extermination of indigenous peoples and expropriation of their lands, the exclusion of Asian immigrants, and the seizure of Mexican lands, to name just some of the structural effects of racial practices in US history. These were institutionalized within US policies and the wider society, and as a result, race became an important mechanism for limiting and restricting access to privilege, power, and wealth. The US that we see today is the result of policies and narratives that, and I'm quoting Dr. Terry Francis here, stratify people in hierarchical and atrocious ways, unquote. This series is an effort to, and here again I'm quoting Terry, to chronicle and investigate the history of these atrocities, as well as to learn how people have struggled to defeat them, escape them, overcome them, and yes, to live with them. It's to talk about how people have confronted racism. Tonight, we discuss policing as a key institution and mechanism that has helped to reinforce the boundaries around privilege, power, and wealth in the US, and these are fundamentally racialized boundaries. As we'll hear tonight from our panelists, policing is foundational to the maintenance of racialized boundaries in myriad ways, most notably through the ever-present threat of violence. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. I'm really delighted that we have these three experts with us tonight. So first, Khalil Gibran Mohammed is Professor of History, Race, and Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School and the Suzanne Young Murray Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. He is the former director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, a division of the New York Public Library, and the world's leading library and archive of global Black history. Before leading the Schomburg Center, Khalil was my colleague here at IU, an associate professor here. And his book, The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America, won the 2011 John Hope Franklin Best Book Award in American Studies. And he is widely published elsewhere and often a commentator on media in various venues. Simon Balto is a scholar, writer, and teacher of history and African American studies. He is the author of Occupied Territory, Policing Black Chicago, From Red Summer to Black Power, which came out with University of North Carolina Press in 2019. And he's written for multiple scholarly and popular publications, including Time, The Washington Post, The Progressive, the Journal of African American History, the Journal of Urban History, and Labor, among others. He teaches at the University of Iowa. Professor Jeannine Bell is a nationally recognized scholar in the area of policing and hate crime. She is the Richard S. Melvin Professor of Law at the IU Maurer School of Law. Bell's research is broadly interdisciplinary, and it touches on both political science and law, and it relies on her empirical expertise. Her most recent book, Hate Thy Neighbor, Move-In Violence and the Persistence of Racial Segregation in American Housing, uses heartbreaking stories to show that, quote, despite professions of tolerance, whites continue to patrol racial borders, which was reviewed in from a review in American Journal of Sociology. Her first book, Policing Hatred, Law Enforcement, Civil Rights, and Hate Crime, is an ethnography of a big city police hate crime unit, based on research that she did actually with those units. So we'll start with giving the panelists a chance just to talk about how their work relates to the topic at hand tonight. And we'll go through hopefully 2 rounds of questions. We may have to adapt given how late we started, but then we will open up to Q&A and further discussion. So feel free to post your comments and questions on the Facebook live stream. Okay, so we'll start with Professor Mohammed, and if you could just tell us a bit about how your work relates to this topic tonight.
Okay, great. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you to everyone who helped put tonight's program together. It's an honor to be in the IU family yet again, and to join 2 wonderful scholars, Jeannine and Simon, on this topic. So my work has, in many ways, helped to explain the saliency of Black criminality as a trope in American history, particularly after slavery. And I've been very engaged in helping to understand the way that our ongoing conversation about policing is tied to a rhetoric of Black criminality. We hear it constantly in the discussion about the trade-off between police reform and spikes in violence. Just as recently as 4th of July weekend, yet again, another round of media commentary about gun violence in Chicago or in New York City or any number of other places that don't always make national headlines. And this alleged trade-off between how police officers protect low-income Black people from themselves is, in many ways, a new spin on an old argument. The new spin is that leading police reformers, including the now retired William Bratton, who led 6 police departments, New York, Los Angeles, back to New York. He began his career in Boston and a few other places, have joined in a set of arguments to push back against the Black Lives Matter movement arguments going back to 2014. And that new argument is essentially that police officers are delivering a new civil right to African Americans, that they are making good on violence reduction as the first way of providing equality to the Black community, and that everything else will flow from there: economic development, affordable housing, better schools, et cetera, et cetera. It's a pretty remarkable argument that these folks are making, and it's not just Bill Bratton who's making it. But it's predicated on this fundamental idea that Black people have a monopoly on violence in their communities. So they have a special crime problem. And the reason why I wanted to start with the present is because the historical arc of the argument is quite salient once you accept that it's all based on crime statistics. So late 19th century, the argument was rooted in biological theories. Slavery had held back the dangerous, violent nature of Black people, had tamed them. Now they were free to roam the southern countryside, raping white women, et cetera, which justified the punitive response of the state. Didn't lead to mass incarceration, but became a coercive instrument of a political economy that was committed to getting Black people back on plantations. The next version of this was the crime panics and fears of the Great Migration era, which were essentially to argue that Black people had a cultural predisposition to violence. They didn't respect property. They didn't respect boundaries. They didn't respect law and order. So they had to be controlled and surveilled. And this is some of the great work that Simon is showing in his book. And then that cultural argument gave way to a kind of political argument about pushing back against the radical excesses of Black freedom activists and Black power activists. This animated the Southern strategy and Richard Nixon in the late 1960s. So at each step along the way, crime statistics, the disproportionate rates of offending of African Americans justified each regime of policing, which in every way we could define in the short time we have together was built to be racist, was built to discriminate, was built as a matter of efficiency to target African Americans based on all of these ideologies of white supremacy. And so here we are with this present argument yet again turning on, we can't do all these crazy things that Black Lives Matter activists are demanding in city after city in the wake of what our lying eyes keep telling us is happening, which is innocent people get killed by the police beyond any justification because Black people are going to kill each other. And what's missing in that argument is my final contribution to how my work connects with this. What's missing in that is in fact the abolitionist argument. And the abolitionist argument that Ruthie Gilmore would make if she were here, the radical geographer and chronicler of racial capitalism, author of Golden Gulag, would say that the abolitionist claim is to push back against organized abandonment, that is to invest in the very communities that have been subject to austerity and abandonment, and that organized violence has been the instrument of justifying that abandonment. And so the two things go hand in hand. Abolition tells us then that we actually have to give back to those communities. We have to invest, we have to return the land. We have to ensure that people have economic security, and therefore the state retreats in terms of its organized violence. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Khalil. So we'll move right into Simon Balto's comments.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Michelle, for the introductions. Thanks to IU for having me. I've never formally been part of the IU family, but I used to live in Indiana when I was in the States, and just admire IU. So I want to just pick up somewhere a little bit echoing some of the things that Khalil was saying, and I want to just actually start with an abolitionist argument, because I think that history itself, the history of policing and the history of racist policing is itself sort of an abolitionist argument. And what I mean by that is that, you know, we can point to the types of things that we've seen being said in the media since the 4th of July, as Khalil pointed out, about how, you know, the violence that we see in Chicago is proof that we need police. But the reality is that the violence that we see in a city like Chicago is evidence that policing doesn't work. Right? It's evidence that policing doesn't work the way that we are typically at least pitched it as working. Because the reality is that, you know, the current moment of violence in Chicago is not really exceptional. And the current rate of violence, or the historic rate of violence in Chicago, is almost completely untethered to whether or not there's a heavy police presence or not a heavy police presence, whether we're investing in the police, although we're always investing in the police these days, or we're not. You know, that the kind of constant reality is that rates of violence, you know, ebb and flow according to a variety of other metrics and issues and austerities and inequalities, and that policing itself, there's just simply no evidence that it actually has any positive impact on reducing that violence. So I raise that as my opening point because this is actually the long history of policing in Chicago and elsewhere. So in my book, one of the lines, or the twin threads that I'm tracing are really about how, over time, Black Chicago came to be simultaneously wildly over-policed, and these are terms that I borrowed directly from Black activists, but came to be both over-policed in the sense that Black communities were subject to wildly disproportionate rates of surveillance, harassment, arrest, stopping, frisking, brutality, torture, death at the hands of the state, subject to all of those things, while at the same time, over the course of the 20th century, because of austerity politics and because of a variety of other issues, those communities were also the most subject to sort of under protection. So if the argument is that police exist to keep us safe, then actually the sort of proof is in the pudding, in the sense that the communities that are the most over-policed are also oftentimes the communities in which people are disproportionately subject to intercommunal violence that stems from larger inequities and inequalities. And so over the course of the 20th century, we can see the evolution of these processes. And really, when I begin my book is in the 19-teens, in particular with the 1919 race riot in Chicago and sort of onward from there, because that's a moment in time in which the urgency for white policymakers and white publics in Chicago of thinking about how they're going to, quote unquote, deal with this new in-migration, or this rapid increasing in-migration of Black people to Chicago. Over the course of the 20th century, a lot of the story is about how policymakers and police are going to respond to that. And so the way that they respond to it is, by increasingly dumping more and more and more money. This is especially true in the aftermath of World War II and in the wake of the Second Great Migration, and then onward, especially in the 1960s, that the ways that they deal with these social problems is to just dump, millions and millions and hundreds of millions and now billions of dollars every year into the police department at the literal cost of other social goods that would actually have positive impacts on harm reduction in a way that policing just doesn't. And so we can sort of look at the past, literally 100 years. My book essentially starts 100 years ago. And I think it's really important for people historically, and this is the final thing I say, I think it's important for people to understand that, the issues that we're dealing with right now are not a recent invention, that we can actually see, dating back to the things that Khalil documents in his book, going back to, into the late 19th century in terms of assumptions of Black criminality, where we can see how those assumptions play out in people's lives and in people's communities for generations. The issues that we're dealing with, although obviously there are new, weapons of violence, there are new weapons of control, there are new versions of systematized repression. The story itself is actually longer than any of us have been. So I'll pause there and look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Okay, thank you, Professor Balto. And now Professor Jeannine Bell.
Hi, thanks so much for that generous introduction, Michelle. I'm really pleased to be talking about my work and to be sharing a stage with Khalil and Simon, scholars that have really interesting things to say about the history of policing. I'm a little different type of scholar. I'm a police scholar who is very nitty-gritty social science-y. I'm an interviewer and I'm an ethnographer. So I've hung around with police. I watch how police operate. I talk to other people about the police to get a check on what they're doing. So for the next couple of minutes, I'm going to briefly describe a couple of examples of my work on policing and race. So my first book, Policing Hatred, and can you switch to the slide, was based on 5.5 months I spent observing a big city hate crime unit. It was the late 1990s, and it was in a city I call Center City. That's not its real name. In Center City, I was observing a specialized detective unit that was responsible for investigating all the hate crimes in the city. And the city's statute was important. It allowed the unit to investigate crimes motivated by bias on the basis of race, religion, sexual orientation, and gender. That's just what the statute said. You may be looking at me and you're thinking, wow, they must have known you were the researcher when everyone saw you. Well, I didn't really stick out as much as you might think, because one of the strengths of the unit was that it was racially diverse. Can you show the next slide, please? Yeah, this shows a little bit of the diversity in the unit. That was one of the things that the people who created the unit did correctly. And I will say in my defense, I didn't make this slide. I know the hair is all wrong. Watching the detectives in Center City, I had absolutely open access to the unit. I had a badge that let me into the office whenever I wanted. I could come and go as I liked. I looked through old case files. I rode around with the cops on patrol. I went on investigations. I went to court with them. And I really got to know how these particular detectives and also how cops in general felt about issues. And when you're hanging out with them 10 hours a day, I did 10-hour shifts for that 5 months. I went on donut runs. I got a real sense of their perspectives about a variety of issues, including police brutality. A big case when I was observing the unit was the Abner Luima case. And I remember the first day I was in the unit, one of the detectives talking to me about how he felt about that particular case. So how did police do? They actually, remember, they're investigating crimes where by and large, in the vast majority of cases, people who are Black, Asian American, Latinx are victims of crime. They actually did quite well. In the book, I talk about the valuable routines officers in the unit use for carefully investigating hate crimes. It turns out that this is actually rare. I've studied hate crimes for the last 20 years, and policing in this context is usually terrible. Most police are really bad at dealing with hate crimes. So there are a couple of points I want to make clear about the application of the research that I did to the events that are happening today. The first is that, that it's not about police behavior in the context in which I studied it is not about who they were. I firmly resist, as a police scholar, the bad apples explanation of policing. Police officers react poorly because they have flawed characters. Some of them might have flawed characters, but I don't think that that's part of why police officers behave inappropriately, brutally. How you create good police is good training, good roles, and good police structure. And that's the part of the problem in policing. The officers I studied served the Black, Latinx, and Asian victims of hate crime. And if we want officers actually serving the community, we have to fundamentally restructure policing. And none of the suggestions I've seen involve fundamentally restructuring policing. So after policing hatred, I wrote a book about an important but not frequently acknowledged type of hate crime that the detectives that I studied in policing hatred had investigated. It's called move-in violence. Move-in violence are crimes directed at Blacks, Asians, Latinx individuals who move to white neighborhoods. Can you show the next slide, please? Yes. Often people think that move-in violence is a thing of the past, but I found out in doing this sort of research, it's not. One portion of the book that examines acts of move-in violence occurring between 1920 and 2010. Can you show the next slide? So the crosses, these are little tiny crosses on this map, show that this type of crime is a nationwide problem all over. There are actually 400 little tiny crosses, incidents that I could actually document that happened. And these aren't the incidents, these are victims. Often several incidents happened. And the type of incident is on the next slide. Can you, so these are fire burnings, cross burnings, harassment, verbal threats, a few homicides, physical attacks. So the biggest lesson of this particular book for the topic of policing is police inadequacy. Extremism, as you know, is a rising problem in the United States, and it turns out that most police are terrible at investigating hate crime. For instance, police are supposed to report hate crimes to the FBI. In 2018, 84% of police departments nationwide reported that not a single hate crime had occurred in their jurisdiction. 84%. So again, I want to stress it's not the cops themselves. This is not an individual officer problem, and it's not even a problem with the law. It's a problem in the ways in which the police are structured. Khalil would probably say it has to do with the origins of the police. I would agree with that. You need to completely restructure policing if you want these sorts of crimes investigated. So the last project I'm going to talk about is the book that I'm writing right now. It's developed in the wake of these well-publicized bystanders videos of police shootings. And I decided in the wake of these videos, I was going to write a book of police reform based on looking at individuals' experiences with the police. So my research assistants and I interviewed people from many different backgrounds to explore how they felt about the police. So I talked to people about their interactions with law enforcement, and I talked to people from many different backgrounds. Can you show the last slide, please? Yes, again, I know the hair is not appropriate. I didn't make this slide. So people were talked to us in the context of interviews about their treatment during what legal scholars call Terry stops, when the law enforcement officer puts on his lights and stops you. None of these encounters involved arrest. Nevertheless, it's really clear that all too frequently, even in the smallest encounters, police behavior is overly violent, overly intrusive, and entirely necessary. And in that way, it destroys the trust individuals of a variety of backgrounds have with law enforcement. I want to conclude by saying that how we're going to fix policing, if we can even fix it, is a really big question. But what we might think about starting to do is to regulate how police treat largely invisible police actions, like investigative stops that touch millions of us every day, and think of that as a first step in reining in the police.
Okay. So I changed locations because my internet was spotty, but I think what I'm going to do in the interest of trying to make sure that the panelists all get to address at least one more question directly before we move to more of a kind of Q&A and discussion format is just to, I have 3 more questions. I'm going to ask each one of you to respond to them in no particular order, I guess. I mean, or at least in no particular relationship to your specific works, but I think you're all expert enough to address the ones that come to you. So for Professor Mohammed, I wonder if you could talk to us about what you think, how do we make sense of the United States' policing as something that is so outside of any other norms, practices, et cetera, as best we can tell, in relation to other countries that are like it, or countries that are not like it. So tell us, I guess, why it is that the United States practices of policing are so distinctive, and the outcomes of those.
Yeah, I'll answer with sort of three broad arguments. One is U.S. empire has been dominant since the middle of the 20th century and has relied extensively on hard and soft power. The hard power, of course, is the footprint of our military, and that has a feedback effect. Our colleague Nicole Siegel has written a wonderful book, Violence Work, which documents the technical assistance apparatus of a particular organization within U.S. government that trains policing in other countries. So we have a particular exceptionalist commitment to a military industrial complex that both works domestically and works abroad. The second is that relative to other liberal democracies, the United States is a far more heterogeneous population. Immigration was the founding raison d'etre with regard to European colonists who were from many different places. And of course, the mixture of indigenous populations with enslaved Africans. No other liberal democracy, particularly in Europe or Asia, can match that history, both in scale and scope temporally. And other kinds of scholars who look at this comparative dimension of US exceptionalism don't so much study US exceptionalism with regard to policing or criminal justice, although Stuart Schrader's new book does. They do look at it with regard to our welfare state. And one way to think about this is we have the stingiest welfare state relative to European countries precisely because of race, because of, or I should say, because of the ascription of racial difference to groups of people in this country. And then the last thing is that we have more guns than any other country in the world. And so with our particular constitutional commitment to the Second Amendment, which of course has evolved and expanded to handgun concealed carry based on a 2011 Supreme Court decision, there are more guns in the United States than there are citizens or residents of this country. So I just say, for a short, brief answer, those three things cover essentially why policing in the United States is so punitive and excessive relative to other places.
Wonderful. Thank you for encapsulating that so beautifully. So for Professor Balto, I wonder if you could talk to us about, so you in your, actually in both, in all of your remarks, you addressed, you know, this issue of abolishing the police. And so I wanted to talk about this particular moment and why it is that, so we, you know, since the murder of George Floyd at the end of May, there's been much more mainstream discussion of, and use of terms like defund the police or abolish the police. And I'm wondering if you could say something about why this moment seems to have generated this intense, more public discussion or more mainstream discussion of these phrases that have been alive, obviously, in activist communities for a very long time. Can you tell us why you think this moment is so intense?
You know, it's a good question, and I think that there's, I think that it's a complex question. I would say first and most importantly that the reason why these ideas are in the mainstream right now is because a lot of organizers, in particular Black feminist organizers, have been, you know, like molding these ideas and working with especially young organizers on enacting these ideas even in small ways in local contexts for years. And so I think that, you know, first and foremost, we owe the presence of these concepts to them. I would also say that I think it's important, I mean, again, to be the historian, you know, for me as a historian, I mean, I think you know, it's also important to understand, and I think it's important for people who are observing and people also who are organizing to understand that, you know, the concept itself is not necessarily brand new of defunding the police, especially. You know, like when I conclude my book, one of the big things that I'm concluding with is this effort by the Panthers in the early 70s to capture community control of the police. And I won't go into all the details of what community control of the police looked like, but it was a core element of it was to look at the hundreds of millions of dollars that the Chicago Police Department was spending the city of Chicago was spending on its police department every single year by that moment in time, and saying, look, we can take those hundreds of millions of dollars and put them into social goods, things that will reduce harm, rather than things that were actively increasing harm at that point. And so, you know, I think it's important for people to understand that, you know, the nomenclature of defund the police is, I think, new. But the concept itself, the argument that, look, police are not worth this investment, that's actually a very old argument that Black organizers and activists especially have been making for a really long time. So, I think that the question of why it's become more mainstream right now is complicated, but I do think that, you know, the reason why we have it even around is because it draws from this longer lineage, both in the more immediate sense of Black women organizers in the past couple of decades, and then sort of stretching back further to a broader recognition that police are not.
Yeah. Thank you. And so then for Professor Bell, I think this will work really nicely, actually. So my last question has to do with the idea of police reform, right? Which is kind of the flip side, or the part of what's being discussed right now that politicians often gravitate to, right? You know, Congress starts to try and legislate, and people are talking about, well, we can, you know, ban the chokehold, or we can make people wear body cams, or we can do all of these things. But in the end, of course, abolitionists would say you can't reform the police. So from your perspective, Jeannine, has police reform ever worked? If so, how would you measure that success? Or if you would call it success, how would you measure it? Can you give us an example? And if not, why not?
This is a great question. So when people talk about reforms, the most recent set of reforms that they love to talk about is the 21st century policing, Obama's 21st century policing initiative. And one of the departments that was a model for the 21st century sort of reforms, right? And spent millions of dollars. I believe the figure is something like $12 million implementing those reforms. Bias training by the best, right? Implicit bias training by the best was Minneapolis, right? So, you know, Minneapolis, where they said that the police department is so rotten that we have to start over. So when I think about reform, that's what I think about, the sort of big literature reforms. If there is a department where we can see reforms having happened, what's touted as an appropriate city is Camden, right? Camden, New Jersey. That's the city where they fired all the cops, ended up hiring a large number of them back. But that's what individuals see as as a place. And one of the things that they did in that department that isn't discussed quite as much, that I think is quite valuable, is what happens when you fire all the cops, is that they broke the union, right? They broke the cop union that was there, right? And the Camden Police are now represented by a collective bargaining agreement, but that's a massive problem, preventing many, many reforms from happening. So if we can't somehow deal with the prospect of police unions, we're not going to be able to make the types of reforms that people who want to defund would like to see. Now, I argue that you can do smaller things that have a big impact on people, but they're not traditionally seen as, huge reforms.
There we go. So could you give us maybe a couple of examples of those small things that you just mentioned at the end?
Oh, small things? One of the things that Fayetteville, for instance, in Toronto, a couple of cities, widely divergent cities have done, is they've said, all right, we're going to get so many people, we're going to get the police out of so many people's lives. And that's part of the problem, right? Is that police are involved in way too many millions of Americans' lives all the time. And part of the defund movement is working to have fewer police. So fewer police means that you're not going to be able to make the stops that you used to make. And that they have experimented with this in Fayetteville and in Toronto, and it really does change people's lives. So you stop for safety reasons only. This is less than the law in this country allows, which means that police departments would have to pull back from what they're allowed to do. And part of the difference in policing in the United States and the policing abroad is that the Supreme Court has given police departments wide authority to do lots of things, right? Stop you basically for anything, right? Reasonable suspicion is a very low standard. There's not a person, even a cop, that can avoid being stopped if someone wants to stop them. And the Supreme Court has said they can make illegal stops in this context. So, and worse, actually. But
thank you. So we have a couple of questions that have come in through the Facebook live stream or through the Facebook comments. And this one is for all the panelists, so I'll put this out there. Is there historical evidence that might help us understand the possibilities for change in the context of a, quote, external event like a pandemic, a potentially revolutionary moment? Does that, do you need a recap of the question? Okay.
I mean, coupling the pandemic with a question about, I guess, some significant racial justice change or policing is a bit of a challenge. one, because none of us are public health or medical historians, but I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me is the Civil War itself. So it's not a virus that transformed the nation, but it was war. And the period of Reconstruction made possible a second founding with very constitutional amendments that are the basis of people's civil rights and civil liberties as we know them today. So many things are possible out of great tumult. That particular moment was foreclosed by a national backlash that wasn't just Southern, but was in fact national. And so I'm not sure, there may be other historical precedents for moments of national crises that then produce new possibilities. I think we see the both and happening. So the question is, how do we avoid the reaction to the reaction? In that sense, I don't know that there's a good historical precedent.
I got nothing more than that.
That question was just straight up hard.
So I guess I'm just thinking comparatively about, you know, people like to sort of celebrate Germany for its memory politics and its seeming ability to have weathered decades of, you know, it's been able to build a social democracy that is responsive to its citizens, and you know, it's managed the pandemic in an admirable way. And one thing I like to remind people is that, you know, Germany was utterly destroyed between 1940 and 1945, and you know, they were then in the position of having to rebuild from scratch in kind of the same way that Khalil just mentioned with regard to the Civil War. And, you know, that creates new possibilities. And so, and I don't by any means want to suggest that Germany is perfect, because it's not, but there are some interesting ways in which, there are some interesting ways that that example kind of allows you to see kind of what it takes to completely reform a society, right? It comes out of this sort of wretched state of defeat, and then it has this opportunity in some ways, and also being directed from outside through the U.S. You know, U.S. aid and all of that. Yeah, so I just wanted to sort of throw that out there, because I think people forget, you know, that Germany really was destroyed, right, by the end of the Second World War. Okay, so let me see. We have another question that came in. Well, this one takes us into academia, which could be interesting. So how can we hold your or our own academic institutions accountable for promoting police presence on campus and the privatization of the police force? Or rather, what should these institutions be doing to solve issues related to policing that were brought up tonight?
I mean, I'll offer some very germinal thoughts, and they're germinal mostly because the reality is I don't know. Because it all depends upon institutions' willingness to actually change. And so I was asked recently to be on a committee at my institution called something like, you know, reimagining public safety. And I'll be very frank that my initial internal response was no. Because I don't believe that institutions want to really change in this. But I also feel like I have an obligation to bring the perspective that I do to that table. And you know, when people were trying to sort of coax me onto this committee, I was told that everything was, quote unquote, everything was on the table. I don't know. But I think that, you know, institutions like universities generally seem to be extraordinarily resistant to change, slow to change. And really, despite the fact that at least a lot of academics in humanities tend to have, left-leaning or leftist politics, the institutions that employ them, generally speaking, do not, and do not, in no way other than just sort of performing. And so, this is it's a moment where, pretty much all universities that I'm familiar with are at least like forming these committees and stuff like that. I don't know what's going on at IU or at Harvard, but this is that's the thing that universities are good at, is forming committees, and what they're really bad at is actually doing it. So I don't know. I mean, but I do think that if there is actual willingness to to scale back investments in university police, to scale back contracts with with local police officers, to be a presence at university events. I think that this is a moment to interrogate the legitimacy of those priorities as they've existed for a lot of years on campuses like mine, and I suspect campuses like yours.
I will tell you a little story about this that's kind of funny. And that reflects some of the comments that Simon just made. So I received a call from a reporter. I talked to reporters a lot in this policing moment. And one reporter reached out to me about university police. And I said, okay, I've done some research on our university police. I, did some interviews about body cams and all sorts of things like that. And I said, but we have a real problem with overlapping jurisdiction, and this is a problem with many university police. University police have the ability to arrest people, to stop people on city streets, and universities want this, cities want this, all sorts of things like that. But, universities get themselves into trouble sending out their police. University of Cincinnati, University of Cincinnati police officer killed someone that they'd stopped for traffic, and when he wasn't convicted, he sued the university for having been wrongfully terminated, and the university settled. So it was a super lose-lose. And I suggested that what universities need to do is they need to A, disarm their officers, and B, they need to take away the ability to have jurisdiction on the streets outside the university. Because I'd had lots of research respondents who told me that the worst cops were the university police. And the reporter stopped and he said, have you let them know that you as a police scholar think that? I said, no. They're not interested in what I think about this. No, I haven't told them what I think that they should do with their police. And it was a very interesting moment for me as a scholar.
Yeah, when you sort of learn that that your research is kind of not relevant to their thinking or how they even imagine approaching these very difficult issues, right? I think a lot of us are feeling that right now. Khalil, anything you'd like to add?
This is just a quick thing, just to add a layer that isn't so much about the behavior of police on campus so much as it is the academic research on our college campuses. And so I also want to mention Nicole's work again, because what's quite apparent in her scholarship, but also right before our eyes, is that the legitimacy that is conferred to policing is also rooted in university research and university communities. And the practitioner work of criminal justice scholars, really going back to the 1960s, has been a kind of intellectual foundation for so much of the policy work that has been animated in the kind of punitive racist policing that we're here talking about. So universities are not neutral in the investments that they've made in, you know, what we might call police science. Police science didn't start in the 1960s. It started much earlier in the 1920s, actually. But nevertheless, it grew and became much more specifically targeted at anti-capitalist, anti-racist organizing, political dissent, the kind of 1968 radicalism that is now being discussed in the wake of the Moyd protest.
Okay. Maybe we'll take one more, and this will bring us to local events. And, you know, for those who maybe haven't been able to follow Bloomington's local news, essentially on July 4th, an African-American man who is a prominent activist in town was assaulted out at a lake that is near Bloomington, Lake Monroe, assaulted by a group of 5 white men who were apparently intoxicated, and you know, the person who was assaulted described the attack as an attempted lynching, and this has been, of course, roiling our community for the last 3 days. And so we have a question from the audience directed at Jeannine, but I think if others have things they'd like to add, feel free. What motivations warrant the prosecution of a hate crime? Bias alone? How often, if at all, do words constitute a hate crime? I'm thinking about the recent Monroe Lake incident on July 4th and the involvement of the FBI. And I guess the context there is that, you know, some of what was said in the recording of what happened in that incident, you know, there's no single derogatory term that was used, but there were words that were used that were suggestive of the words we all are familiar with, right? So Jeannine, could you start with that?
Oh, so words may suggest motivation. This is true in a variety of contexts, and that's the way it works in hate crime. You're looking for, why did they do that? Sort of behave in that way, commit that assault. So that's what signals that something is a hate crime. Now, Indiana's hate crime statute is not as strong as other hate crime statutes, meaning that our recently passed hate crime statute is not what you would pass in, not what you'd sort of want, right? In fact, I heard recently someone from outside of, a legislator from outside of Indiana say that, oh yeah, well, Indiana doesn't really have a hate crime statute, despite the fact that we here in Indiana are quite proud of the fact that we finally moved off the list of the 5 states without hate crime legislation. But in the vast majority of places, words can constitute evidence of motivation, not just in hate crime cases, but also in other sorts of cases. And you don't need slurs, right? Slurs are indicative of motivation, but other things are as well. So you don't need them. All the accounts that I've read of this particular incident suggest that it's quite clear the perpetrators were doing something that was a hate crime. Now, perpetrators often say all sorts of things in their defense, but they're going to have a hard time in this particular case arguing it. Now, the intoxication is something that they frequently, cross-burners, for instance, use in those sorts of cases, because evidently there are lots of cross-burners who are drunk. I've looked at lots of cases in this context. So do you think that captured what the person was looking for?
Hard for me to know, because I can't engage with that person, but yeah, it's definitely helpful, I think, to kind of parse that, the language question, because yeah, I mean, anybody who watched the videos, I think, develops a pretty strong sense that this was a racially motivated crime perpetrated against this African-American man. But if you're looking for that one word that's gonna trigger like some kind of immediate check, or it's gonna allow you to make the check and say, oh, yep, that's a hate crime, it's not really there. So I think it speaks to kind of the need to be able to also interpret the scene in using different kinds of methods, right? I mean, there's also a whole sort of performativity that's happening there. I don't want to get too academic, but I think there's a lot going on in those videos that are beyond the any specific word that you could point to and say, like, this makes it a hate crime. So
yeah, and for First Amendment reasons, we don't want to think of words as being the only thing that makes it a hate crime. Civil libertarians, lots of people don't really like that at all, because they suddenly argue, well, when am I going to be able to use those slurs that I want to use so much? If you start criminalizing words like that. No, that's not really what they say. But that seems to be what they mean.
Yeah. Okay, so I just got one in, and this may be the last one before I turn to giving the panelists a last word. And this is good because it'll bring the policing element back in. So commenters are asking if they can discuss the DNR, so the Department of Natural Resources, who were the ones who responded to this incident this past weekend. One of the, I think, 8 policing agencies that have jurisdiction here in and around Bloomington. So asking if they can discuss the DNR's involvement in that event and what that means for the investigation. And so I guess Jeannine may have the most kind of detailed read of this given our local setting, but in terms of jurisdiction questions and these kind of layered policing questions, if Simon and Khalil also have thoughts on that, I think it would be great to hear from you too.
So what I thought was most remarkable about the DNR actions in this context is they said, oh, we don't need to arrest anybody right here. Clearly assaultive. Video, we don't need to arrest anybody here. And it's very typical of law enforcement to not take white supremacy seriously. Law enforcement all over this country does not take white supremacy seriously. They don't think about it in their ranks at all, in part because they would really need to let some officers go if they took white supremacy seriously. So it makes it hard in situations like this one to actually arrest people for crimes that are really, really bad. And the DNR now has egg all over their face. But if they paid attention for 1 second, if the organization itself paid attention to white supremacy for 1 second, it wouldn't have been so hard for them.
Yeah, and I'll just add that you know, DNR is implicated in another racial profiling incident that happened maybe a week ago, also on the lake, in which a group of African Americans on a boat on the lake were accused of harassing white people on a boat on the lake, and you know, the people who responded were also DNR police. And yeah, on this question of kind of layered jurisdictions, we also have had this incident where a star basketball player who played for Bloomington, one of the Bloomington high schools, was stopped in his own neighborhood while he was on a walk by a police officer who works in a completely different county, right? So, you know, within a week, we've had these 3 cases of jurisdictional, what feels like jurisdictional overreach, but then also the sense that, you know, they're still cops and they still do things the same way. So, Simon, Khalil, any comments or thoughts on anything that was raised there?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, Khalil, I just sort of stepped there. I mean, I won't speak to the local context because I just frankly don't know it. But you know, in terms of layered jurisdictions, I mean, I think it's important that people understand and appreciate just how saturated our society is with people given police power. You know, so whether that be DNR agents or whether that be university police. I mean, one thing this sparked in my mind when Jeannine was talking about university police, but you know, my first time at the University of Chicago was when I was there as a graduate student. I wasn't a graduate student at the University of Chicago, but I was a graduate student who was doing research at the University of Chicago. And one of the things that I was most struck by when I first arrived there at the library to try to, you know, first find parking and then, you know, just actually get to where I needed to go was just how unbelievable University of Chicago's police presence is. And it's separate from the city of Chicago's, right? And so, but it's like, you know, if you exist in that, you know, in within the jurisdiction of the University of Chicago Police Department, you're subject to, you know, to both their power and to the city of Chicago's. And, you know, again, to amplify the point, it's not just confined to campus. I mean, University of Chicago's University of Chicago PD's jurisdiction stretches, it's somewhere between 15 and 20 blocks north of campus. I mean, it's like they don't patrol University of Chicago campus, they patrol the South Side, you know, in addition to the city of Chicago police in the South Side. And so, you know, it's like, I also just read, I recently read Walter Johnson's new book on St. Louis, and like he reports in that book that St. Louis County has 61 separate police departments right now. I mean, it's dizzying when you think about the number of people, the number of officers, the number of agencies that have the ability and the authority to police people. It's absolutely mind-blowing. And the degrees to which it just saturates everything is horrible. So that, I mean, that's what I'll say about it.
Thank you, Simon. Khalil?
Yeah, and just to kind of wrap up, I think that the story of what happened with Mr. Booker in Bloomington recently echoes a very old theme, which is that policing is just an expression of many versions of a white supremacist society, where the presumption of guilt, collective guilt attached to non-whites is the governing logic and the understanding. Everything else has to be disproven. And so whether it's DNR, which I actually remember fishing on Lake Lake Monroe a couple of times without a fishing license and worried that I might get stopped by the DNR. But this collective guilt that attaches to non-whites in the United States seeps into absolutely everything. And it is as much about the story of the excessive use of force that animates so much of the movement work right now as it is about the under punishing of white violations, whether they are outright terror in the work that Jeannine has done so well, or in the kind of work that the everyday expressions of threat, as we saw with Central Park Karen or Amy Cooper in the case of weaponizing the police. I mean, these things are not aberrational. And so in a society saturated with policing, built on white supremacist logics, and has defined groups of people as collectively guilty, of which they then have to prove their innocence, it doesn't really matter who has jurisdiction here or there or anywhere. These are just line items in a state budget somewhere that with a different name.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you all. That was, I think, really useful for us in Bloomington to, as we continue the work of following up with what happened this past weekend and past week. So I guess I'll just give each panelist a last chance to say anything that maybe they didn't get to address, either because we started late or if they wanted to pick up on anything that other panelists mentioned that they'd like to engage before we call it a night. So if anyone wants to start, just jump on in.
I'll just say thank you for having me. So I'm grateful to have been.
Thank you. It was great having you back, Khalil, virtually.
You know, I would just say very briefly, in addition to saying thank you to you, Michelle, and to everyone else in the panels, I would just say that I think that it's important for people who are involved in the current movement and moment to know that you know they're part of a lineage of people who have contested police power and contested state violence. You know, and that goes back to you know, the era of slavery. Right? I mean, people contesting the authority and the ability of agents of the state, whether even if the state is just the local authorities, agents of the state to control freedom, to control people's bodies, to re-enslave people, and so on and so forth. And so, you know, we have there's a very long lineage of people. You know, whether we're talking about resistance to slave patrol and so on and so forth. When we're talking about Black communists, rejecting the authority of police officers during the Great Depression when they were enforcing evictions. Whether we're talking about the Panthers, whether I mean, there's just I think when I think it's useful for people. I hope it's useful for people to understand that we are part of a longer lineage of people really who are rejecting this sort of state power and this sort of state violence and demanding something else and demanding something better. And maybe that goes in a different direction and people think, wow, this struggle is never ending. And I mean, as Angela Davis would say, freedom is a constant struggle, right? So, I would just say that I think it's important for people to understand that, that the current struggle, just like the current repression, does not exist sort of out of time. Neither does the.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Jeannine, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I first want to thank you, Michelle, and everyone involved in putting this together, and also my two fellow panelists. We all have many, many demands on our time, so it was so fabulous for you guys to take time out. I learned so much from both of you. And finally, to the people watching, I want you to keep pressure up. I'm someone who talks to reporters all the time and has been watching this for a long time, there is movement now because you've been out there asking questions and pressing for something different than the past. So keep up, keep on.
Thank you. I love ending on that note. And we did have, we've had 2 nights in a row of protests here in Bloomington. So I think, you know, that we're very much part of the pushback that, you know, people have been seeing nationwide, but which in some ways seems to have dropped out of media coverage. But yeah, the struggle is ongoing. It's part of a lineage. We have predecessors and, you know, people are training the next generation. So I want to thank you all for joining me tonight. And yeah, this was great. And thank you to the audience for your comments and questions, which also really helped animate that last half hour. So yeah, we'll be back again in this digital space next Tuesday to talk about protest and change, which is a good, you know, a good follow-up to what we just ended on. So thank you all and good night.